Silence is one of the most powerful forces in human interaction. It is often underestimated, yet it holds the ability to speak louder than any words ever could. When you remove yourself from someone's life, your absence creates a void, a space where your presence once lived, and that void does not go unnoticed. The very person who may have once ignored you, dismissed you, or taken you for granted will begin to feel it. He may not say a word. He may act as if nothing has changed. But inside, there is a shift, a disturbance in his mind that he cannot ignore. See, human nature is fascinating. We tend to crave what we no longer have access to. The mind begins to play tricks, forcing a person to remember, to analyze, to rethink every moment, every conversation, every experience shared. And when there is no closure, no explanation, no chase, the weight of that silence grows heavier. He may not admit it to you. He may not even admit it to himself. But the reality remains, he is losing sleep over you. The power of silence works in ways most people never fully understand. It creates mystery. It forces reflection. It leaves the other person with nothing but their own thoughts, their own emotions, their own regrets. And that is where the battle begins. Not for you, but for him. He may try to distract himself, filling his days with noise, with work, with meaningless conversations. But when the night comes, when everything slows down, that silence creeps in. And in that silence, your absence is deafening. The mind cannot simply erase someone who once held significance. Even if he once acted like he didn't care, like you were replaceable, like your emotions didn't matter. None of that changes the reality of human attachment. He may have been confident in his choices when you were still around, when you were still available, still reaching out, still hoping for things to be different. But the moment you stopped, the moment you fell silent, the moment you chose to withdraw your energy, something inside of him began to shift. At first, he may not have noticed. He may have been content, believing that his decision was final, that walking away was easy. But as time passes, something unexpected happens. He begins to wonder. He begins to question. He begins to replay past interactions, searching for signs, for meaning, for answers to a question he didn't expect to have. Why does this feel different? That's the thing about silence. It doesn't give closure. It doesn't explain. It doesn't justify. It simply exists, leaving the other person to fill in the blanks themselves. And that is where the real discomfort begins. Because now, instead of hearing your voice, instead of receiving a message, instead of feeling your presence in any way, he is left alone with his own thoughts. They begin to create their own stories. Maybe he thinks you've moved on. Maybe he wonders if you ever truly cared. Maybe he begins to believe that you were the one who had control all along. And these thoughts, they don't just appear once and disappear. No, they repeat. They cycle through his mind like an unfinished song, playing over and over, reminding him that something is missing. The more silent you remain, the stronger these thoughts become. The ego resists, trying to convince him that he made the right choice, that you were never that important, that he can replace what was lost. But deep down, the subconscious mind doesn't lie. And at night, when he lays in bed, when the distractions are gone, when there is nothing left but the weight of his own mind, the truth settles in. He feels it. He doesn't say it, but he feels it. And here's the thing, he will never admit it. His pride won't let him. His ego won't allow it. He may act like everything is fine, like your silence means nothing, but inside there is a war happening. One side of him trying to maintain control, trying to convince himself that you were never as valuable as you were. The other side, the one that wakes him up at night, the one that makes him hesitate before opening his phone, the one that forces him to check if you've reached out, that side knows the truth. The truth is that he underestimated you. He assumed you would always be there, always waiting, always seeking his attention. He expected a reaction. He expected anger, sadness, desperate attempts to reconnect. But what he didn't expect, what he never prepared for, was your silence. Silence is a teacher. It teaches lessons words never could. It forces people to confront their own emotions, their own mistakes, their own insecurities. And right now, in his mind, there is no escape from that lesson. He can pretend all he wants. He can act as if he doesn't care, as if his life hasn't changed. But when no one is watching, when he's left alone with nothing but his own thoughts, your silence is speaking to him louder than you ever did. He can never admit it, but he feels it. He feels the absence. He feels the difference. And most importantly, he feels the weight of a mistake he never thought would come back to haunt him. The moment everything changed was not when he walked away, not when he ignored you, not even when he acted like you didn't matter. No, the real shift happened the second you stopped chasing. That was when the dynamic turned. That was when the invisible balance of power tilted in your favor. Because in relationships, in connections, in any human interaction, the one who values their energy the most, the one who refuses to beg, to plead, to convince, is the one who holds the true power. You see, for as long as you were reaching out, for as long as you were making the effort, for as long as you were proving your worth, he never had to question anything. He never had to feel uncertain. He never had to wonder where you stood, what you felt, what you were willing to do to keep him in your life. Your presence was a certainty, something he could count on, something he assumed would always be there, waiting, watching. And as long as you remained in that position, the power was in his hands. But then something changed. Maybe it was gradual, maybe it was sudden, but at some point you made a decision, whether consciously or not, to withdraw your energy, to stop explaining yourself, to stop overextending, to stop waiting for something that was never meant to be forced. And that single decision was more powerful than any words you could have spoken. Because when you finally let go, the control he thought he had over the situation started to slip through his fingers. At first he didn't notice. He was comfortable in the idea that you would always be available. He assumed you would continue trying. But then something began to feel different. The silence stretched a little longer. The absence became a little more obvious. The attention he once dismissed, the validation he once took for granted was no longer there. And that's when the discomfort began. The human mind is wired for patterns. It craves consistency. It relies on predictability. And when a pattern suddenly changes, when something that was once a given is no longer there, it triggers a response, a mental alarm that something is off. That is exactly what happened the moment you stopped reaching out. Suddenly, there was no longer a guarantee of your presence. No longer an assurance that you were still available, still invested, still waiting. And that uncertainty started to eat at him in ways he wasn't prepared for. The first stage is denial. He convinces himself that nothing has changed, that you're just busy, that sooner or later you'll return to the familiar cycle. But as more time passes, as the silence remains, as you continue to exist outside of his reach without explanation, the second stage begins curiosity. He starts to wonder, to check, to notice. Maybe he scrolls through your social media. Maybe he rereads old messages. Maybe he asks around. But no matter what he does, there is one undeniable truth he is beginning to realize. The control he thought he had is slipping. And that realization, it does something to him. It forces him to sit with the one thing he was never prepared for: doubt. Because now, instead of assuming that you are still emotionally attached, instead of believing that you are still affected, he has to consider the possibility that you have moved on, that maybe you no longer care, that maybe the power he thought he held was never real to begin with. That's when the shift becomes undeniable. At this point, he is not the one being pursued anymore. He is not the one in control. He is not the one making decisions from a place of certainty. No, that role now belongs to you. And the irony, he will never admit it. He will act like everything is fine, like your absence doesn't affect him, like he is completely unbothered, but deep down he feels it. The void, the change, the lack of attention that was once so easy to take for granted, it all starts to weigh on him in ways he never expected. This is the moment where his mind begins to work against him. He starts overthinking, wondering if he made the right choices, questioning whether he misjudged your value. And yet, he cannot bring himself to say it. His pride will not allow it. His ego will not let him admit that the power has shifted. So instead, he pretends. He pretends that he doesn't notice. He pretends that he isn't bothered. He pretends that your silence is meaningless. But behind that facade, behind the carefully crafted exterior of indifference, there is turmoil. There is a battle happening within him that he cannot escape. Because no matter how much he tries to suppress it, one thought continues to resurface over and over again. He no longer holds the power. There is something about human nature that resists the truth, especially when that truth forces someone to confront their own mistakes. He will never say it out loud. He will never admit that he was wrong, that he miscalculated, that he took something valuable and discarded it without fully realizing what he was losing. His pride won't allow it. His ego won't let him. Instead, he will convince himself that he is in control, that nothing has changed, that his life is exactly the same as it was before. But the truth is much different than the version he tells himself. Because late at night, when the distractions are gone, when the conversations fade, when the noise quiets, there is a space in his mind that refuses to be ignored. That space is filled with memories, with thoughts of you, with the realization that something he once had is no longer there. He won't text, he won't call, he won't show any signs that he's thinking about you. But that doesn't mean he isn't. That doesn't mean he's unaffected. That doesn't mean he isn't silently replaying every interaction, every conversation, every moment where he was certain that you would never leave. The mind works in interesting ways. It has a way of distorting the past, of making things appear one way when they were actually another. And right now, his mind is trying to rewrite history, trying to convince him that he made the right decision, that he wasn't at fault, that losing you wasn't a loss at all. But deep down, beneath all of that justification, beneath all of that self-protection, there is something else brewing. Regret. Regret doesn't always come immediately. It doesn't always appear the second you walk away. At first, he probably felt nothing. Maybe he even felt relieved. Maybe he told himself that this was what he wanted, that he was free, that life would be better without you in it. He distracted himself. He filled his time with other people, other experiences, other ways to avoid sitting with the weight of his choices. And for a while it may have worked, but there is one thing about regret that cannot be avoided. It always finds a way to surface. It creeps in slowly, unexpectedly, in the quiet moments when he least expects it. Maybe it's triggered by a song, by a familiar scent, by a passing thought that reminds him of something only you knew about him. And suddenly, the wall he built around his emotions begins to crack just a little. The thoughts come flooding in, uninvited, unwelcome, but persistent nonetheless. He tries to push them away, tries to silence them with distractions, but no matter how much he resists, they don't leave. Because that's the thing about losing someone who truly cared about you. It doesn't hit all at once. It unfolds over time, piece by piece, until one day he realizes that what he thought was insignificant was actually irreplaceable. And the worst part, he knows he cannot take it back. That is the weight of regret. Is the realization that the door he once assumed would always be open is now closed. Is the understanding that the messages he expected to receive, the presents he took for granted, the attention he once dismissed, all of it is gone. And no matter how much he wishes he could go back, he can't. But here's the part he will never admit. He expected you to wait. He thought that even if he walked away, even if he pulled back, even if he acted like he didn't care, you would still be there. That's what his ego told him. That's what he believed. And that's why the silence, the absence, the lack of any sign that you're still thinking about him hits him harder than he could have ever anticipated. Because now, for the first time, he is the one feeling uncertain. He is the one wondering. He is the one questioning whether you have moved on, whether you ever truly needed him as much as he assumed you did. And that thought is what keeps him awake at night. That thought is what lingers in the back of his mind, haunting him in ways he cannot fully articulate. But he will never tell you this. He will never show it. He will never let his pride crumble enough to say, I miss you. Instead, he will act as if nothing has changed, as if he is unbothered, as if his life has continued without a second thought about you. But behind that mask, behind the confidence he pretends to have, behind the silence that he uses as a shield, there is a truth that he cannot escape. And that truth is this: he underestimated you. He thought you would always be there. He thought that no matter what he did, you would never truly walk away. And now that you have, now that your presence is no longer a given, he is forced to sit with the one thing he never expected to feel: doubt. Doubt about his choices, doubt about his assumptions, doubt about whether or not he made a mistake that cannot be undone. And that realization, it will stay with him, whether he acknowledges it or not. Because no matter how much he tries to ignore it, no matter how much he pretends that it doesn't matter, no matter how much he convinces himself that his life is exactly the same without you, deep down, in the quiet moments when he is alone with nothing but his thoughts, the truth whispers to him. And that truth is something he cannot escape. There is something powerful about indifference. Not forced indifference, not the kind that's put on for show, but the real kind. The kind that comes when you no longer seek validation, no longer crave an explanation, no longer hold on to what was lost. That kind of indifference is rare because it can't be faked. It can't be rushed. It comes only when a person has truly detached, when they have reached a level of self-worth so strong that they no longer feel the need to question, to chase, to wonder. And that kind of detachment is exactly what he never expected from you. He thought that even if you stopped talking to him, even if you stepped away, there would still be some part of you waiting, some part of you that remained emotionally connected. He thought that at any moment, if he decided to return, you would still be there, open, willing, hopeful. But that's where he miscalculated. Because what he didn't account for, what he didn't understand, was that when you truly let go, when you genuinely stop caring about the outcome, everything shifts. At first, he didn't notice. People like him never do. When someone is used to being the center of attention, when they are used to knowing they have an effect on others, they assume their presence is permanent in your mind. He likely assumed that even if you weren't reaching out, even if you weren't showing signs of missing him, you were still thinking about him. That's how his mind works. He doesn't realize that silence can mean indifference. He assumes silence means waiting, longing, hesitation. But then time passed. More than he expected, more than he was comfortable with. And for the first time, something unusual happened. His thoughts started drifting to you. Not because he wanted to, not because he chose to, but because the absence of something once familiar has a way of making itself known. He wondered why you hadn't checked in, why you hadn't tried to mend things, why you hadn't done what he assumed you always would. At first, he shrugged it off, told himself he didn't care, told himself you were being stubborn, playing games. But then the curiosity grew, because when someone is truly indifferent, when someone truly stops reacting, it creates an unfamiliar void. He was used to knowing he had an effect on you, used to believing that even if things were strained, he could still occupy space in your mind. But now he wasn't so sure. So he started looking for signs, little things, a hint on social media, a mutual friend who might mention your name, something, anything, to confirm that he still existed in your world. And when he found nothing, when he realized that you weren't just silent but truly absent, it did something to him. Because now for the first time, he was the one wondering. He was the one feeling the shift. But pride is a stubborn thing. He won't reach out, not yet. He won't admit that your absence affects him. Instead, he will do the only thing his ego allows him to do. He will convince himself that he is still in control, that he still holds power over the situation. And how does he do that? By pretending. Pretending he doesn't care. Pretending it doesn't matter. Pretending he isn't affected. But here's what he doesn't realize. True indifference is not about pretending. It's not about playing a game or trying to manipulate an outcome. True indifference is about freedom. It's about emotional liberation. It's about no longer needing a reaction, no longer hoping for an explanation, no longer carrying the weight of something that no longer serves you. And that is exactly what you have stepped into. The most powerful shift happens when you stop looking back, when you stop waiting for closure, when you stop needing anything from someone who was never willing to give you what you deserved in the first place. Because the moment you reach that place, the entire dynamic changes. He feels it even if he doesn't say it. He notices it even if he never acknowledges it. And it unsettles him in ways he never expected. Because now for the first time you are untouchable. You are no longer within his reach. And that is the one thing he never anticipated. That you wouldn't just step away, but that you would do so without hesitation, without resistance, without any lingering attachment. And that is what keeps him up at night. Not just the loss, not just the silence, but the realization that he is no longer a factor in your world. He will try to convince himself otherwise. He will tell himself stories, create scenarios in his mind where he still holds significance. But deep down, somewhere beneath the surface, he knows. He knows that your energy has shifted, that your focus is elsewhere, that you are no longer tethered to his existence. And that realization, that is what will haunt him long after you have moved on. But there is a weight that comes with losing something valuable. At first, it doesn't always register. At first, it feels like a choice, like a decision made in confidence, like an action taken with certainty. But time has a way of revealing the truth. Time has a way of exposing what the heart already knows, but the mind tries to deny. And in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the night, when distractions are no longer enough to keep the thoughts at bay, that weight settles in. It is heavy, persistent, undeniable. He won't say it. He won't let the words form. He won't even let himself acknowledge it fully. But it's there. That gnawing, nagging realization that something once steady, something once comforting, something once within his grasp is gone. Not temporarily, Not in a way that he can undo with a simple message or a quick conversation, but in a way that feels different this time, in a way that feels final. At first, he tried to convince himself that it didn't matter, that your absence didn't affect him, that your silence was insignificant. He told himself that life would go on exactly as it did before, that nothing had changed, that he would wake up and move through his days without a second thought. But the mind is not so easily fooled. The mind remembers. The mind replays moments, pieces together memories, fills in the spaces where something, someone used to be. And so no matter how much he tries to fight it, no matter how much he tells himself that this is what he wanted, there is something he cannot escape, a lingering feeling, a weight on his chest, a tension he cannot quite place. Because deep down, there is something unsettled, something unfinished, something unresolved. He doesn't like this feeling. It is unfamiliar. It is uncomfortable. It is something he has worked hard to avoid, because admitting that he feels this way would mean admitting that he was wrong, that he miscalculated, that he made a choice he cannot undo. And that is the hardest thing for someone like him to accept, that they are not as in control as they believed. So instead of facing it, instead of acknowledging it, he will do what he does best. He will distract himself. He will bury himself in work, in social settings, in empty conversations. He will find new distractions, new people, new things to occupy his time. He will make sure the world sees him as unaffected, as unbothered, as completely detached. But beneath the surface, there is a different reality. Because the thing about loss, the thing about losing someone who truly cared, someone who truly invested, someone who truly saw him, is that it leaves a mark. It lingers in ways he never expected. It does not simply fade away with time. In fact, time often amplifies it. Because the more time that passes, the more obvious it becomes, the more undeniable it feels. The more he begins to recognize what is missing. He thought you would always be there. He thought he had time. He thought that no matter what happened, no matter how much space he took, no matter how far he distanced himself, you would still be waiting. But now he is faced with a reality he never prepared for. A reality where you are gone, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, completely. He won't admit this. He won't say it out loud. He won't let the words leave his mouth, because that would mean facing the truth. And the truth is that he underestimated you. The truth is that he took your presence for granted. The truth is that he assumed you needed him more than he needed you. And now that you have removed yourself, now that you have truly let go, now that you are no longer tied to his world, he is left with something unexpected. Emptiness. That emptiness is not immediate, doesn't hit all at once. It creeps in slowly over time in the moments when he least expects it. It shows up when he hears something that reminds him of you, when he scrolls past something familiar, when he catches himself thinking about a conversation you once had. It lingers in the spaces where he once assumed he had control. And the worst part, he knows he cannot undo it. He knows that reaching out won't change things. He knows that the version of you that once cared, that once gave, that once fought for him is gone. Because people don't stay where they are undervalued. People don't remain where they are taken for granted. And now he must live with that truth. He must live with the knowledge that he had something real, something rare, something meaningful, and he let it slip away. He will never say it. He will never show it. He will never give you the satisfaction of knowing that it keeps him up at night. But that does not change the fact that it does. That does not change the fact that his mind drifts to you when he least expects it. That does not change the fact that regret is a heavy thing to carry. And no matter how much he tries to ignore it, no matter how much he pretends it doesn't exist, It is there. It is real. It is something he cannot escape. There is something unsettling about silence. Not the kind that happens in passing, not the kind that fills the gaps between conversations, but the deep, unshakable kind. The silence that comes when someone who once cared no longer does. That silence is not empty. It is not passive. It is charged with meaning, thick with finality. It carries a message louder than any words could ever express. And that is exactly the silence he never expected from you. He assumed that no matter what happened, there would always be a thread of connection between you. Even if you weren't speaking, even if you had taken a step back, he believed that you still thought of him, still checked for him, still held space for him in your mind. But now he's realizing that something is different. This silence does not feel like hesitation. It does not feel like a waiting game. It does not feel like the kind of silence that begs for a response. It feels like absence. It feels like you are truly gone. At first, he convinced himself that he didn't care, that he was unaffected, that your silence was nothing more than a phase. But then time stretched on and something began to shift. He found himself waiting for something, anything. A sign, a slip, a moment of weakness from you. He told himself that eventually you would break the silence, that you would reach out, that you would remind him of the role he once played in your life. But it never happened. And with each passing day, the realization grew heavier. He had lost the version of you that once longed for him. He won't admit this. He won't say it out loud. Instead, he will do what people always do when they feel a loss they don't want to acknowledge. He will distract himself. He will fill his time with noise, with people, with anything that keeps him from sitting alone with his thoughts. But no amount of distraction will erase the fact that he feels it, that he notices it, that the absence of you is something he did not prepare for. He thought he could replace you. That's what people like him do. They move on quickly. They fill the space. They seek validation elsewhere. But no matter how many conversations he has, no matter how many new people he entertains, there will always be one thing missing. What you gave him. The way you saw him. The way you made him feel. Because the truth is, no one can replicate what was real. No one can recreate the way someone truly invested in them. And now he is starting to realize that.